Hello, my name is Parker Cruz, and this is my presentation on gun control in America. Shots Fired, Gun Control in America by Parker Cruz. On May 24th, 2022, an 18-year-old man around 11:30 a.m. entered Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, and went to kill 19 students and 2 teachers. This tragedy has yet again sparked the decade-long debate about the issue for gun control. To start, we need to clearly define what gun control is. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines gun control as the regulation of the selling and owning and use of guns. I, along with many others, have an opinion on what gun control is and what it should look like. The purpose of this essay is to inform what exactly is gun control and how we should be stopping any more terrible attacks from happening. I am against gun control in the sense of completely restricting and preventing people from owning firearms. However, I am for gun safety and regulation. Gun safety and regulation is something that I believe should be used to provide a proper and safe way for people to buy guns from licensed dealers, actively try to remove the black market for guns, and properly analyze who should have guns and who should not. In this presentation, I will dive into the history of gun violence, gun control, and racial issues, the difference between control and regulation, and the relationship between gun violence and mental illness. Gun violence has been prevalent in this country for ages. However, it seems to have even been more prevalent in the 21st century. Let's give an overview of some of the most notable events in the past 13 years. Since 2009, there have been a total of 277 mass shootings in the United States. The biggest mass shooting in the past 9 years happened in Las Vegas, Nevada in 2017. On October 1st, 2017, Stephen Paddock started opening fire on the crowd of a very populated country music festival happening across the street from his hotel. According to History.com, Paddock shot over 1,100 rounds of ammunition throughout the first 10 minutes of the attack. Authorities found Paddock dead in the hotel room from self-inflicted gunshots. Paddock killed a total of 58 people and injured more than 800. This shooting was the largest mass shooting in United States history. In response to the attack, debate on new gun control legislation began. The primary argument was about banning bump stocks. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, in 2018, Attorney General Matthew Whitaker defined a bump stock as devices that allow a shooter of a semi-automatic firearm to initiate a continuous firing cycle while with a single pull of the trigger. Many politicians have pushed for the banning of bump stock devices, but as of 2022, they are still legal in all states. Another large mass shooting happened not very far from where I grew up. On June 12, 2016, 49 people were killed at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Gunman Omar Martin opened fire in the packed nightclub around 2 a.m. Then, for the next 3 hours, Omar and the police were in a standoff. It wasn't until around 4 a.m. police breached the building and subdued the shooter. Before the Las Vegas attack, this was the largest mass shooting in American history. The aftermath resulted in a push for gun control laws, but no specific laws were created in response. The reason I focus on these 2 events specifically is 1, they are the 2 largest mass shootings in United States history, and 2, they show how they both had different responses to them. Now, let's transition from these events and focus on the next topic at hand: the relationship between race and gun violence. According to Brady United, gun violence alone reduces the life expectancy by 4 years for African Americans. Many people view gun control as a racial issue that divides America. A part of this is true. According to an article by the Washington Post, 18.51 people of 100,000 black African Americans die from a firearm-related death each year. That same study shows that out of 100,000 white people, only 9.05 people die from firearm-related deaths. That means, based on the study, black people are twice as likely to die from gun-related deaths than white people. This information is very convincing as to why race and gun control are related negatively. However, there is some evidence that guns and race have resulted in positive change. In 1957, in Monroe, North Carolina, the black members of the community petitioned to allow them into the public swimming pool. As a result of this, the local KKK started to run motorcades to the black neighborhoods of town. Later on, the vice president of the local NAACP would be threatened, and this would cause members of the organization to band together to form an armed watch party. On your screen, you'll see a picture of the president of the NCAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. His name is Robert F. Williams. The watch would prove effective because in October, the watch was able to fire at the motorcade and ran them away. This resulted in the city council banning motorcades. This is a prime example of how firearms could be used in a positive light to fight against violence without harming anyone. In an academic journal by Dustin Crummett, he argues that the very right to own a firearm is less of a hindrance to minority groups, but rather a way to hinder any systematic violence against them. At the beginning of my writing, I defined what exactly gun control is. I want to reestablish what the definition is one more time. I defined exactly what gun control is: the regulation of the selling and owning and use of guns. Now, to most anti-gun control people, this definition would probably be fine. A lot of the divide on the stance on gun control comes from the wording of the phrase. When people hear about gun control, they automatically think that that people want to take their guns away. However, this is not what the phrase means at all. Now, if you look for the definition of gun regulation, we cannot find one. This is because the two phrases are very similar. However, using gun regulation over gun control would frighten and anger fewer people. Over the past century, gun control has been hyped up by politicians and media as the ending of the Second Amendment and the banning of all firearms. A lot of people feel that the strict gun control isn't the solution, but rather just adds to the problem. A lot of people feel that strict gun control, in an article by Lester Hunt, he breaks down what should be the aim of gun control. Hunt states in this article, gun control does not include safety regulations aimed at taking defective guns off the market, nor does it include laws that prohibit firearms to dangerous users such as children or people with records of relevant sources of crime or mental illness. Gun regulation is something that is happening in America, and it can be very effective. In an article by Drew Stevenson and Jenna R. Shorter entitled Revisiting Gun Control and Tort Liability, they dive into the idea of universal background checks and restrictions on certain assault weapons. Stevens and Shorter also focus on the idea of tort liability, when it comes to gun regulations. To give a basic definition, tort liability is when someone is held accountable for wrong actions. Shorter and Stevens make the argument, therefore, a victim of gun violence should be allowed to individually sue gun manufacturers and distributors. Not only would gun manufacturers and distributors face liability for negligent business practice, but victims, survivors, and other affected communities of gun violence could be made whole again through monetary damages. The use of tort liability would allow for an increase in gun safety without having had to intrude on the idea of banning guns. In the 21st century, we have seen not just a rise in gun violence, but also a rise in mental illness. As defined by the American Psychiatric Association, mental illness are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, or a combination of these things. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and are problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. While there are a lot of people that like to paint the narrative that gun violence is the cause of mental illness, that is not the case. Only about 4% of interpersonal violence is attributed to mental illness alone. In the article entitled Missing the Mark, gun control is not the cure for what ails the U.S. mental health system. Carolyn Reinhardt-Wolf and Jamie A. Rosen dive into the relationship between mental illness and gun violence. Wolf and Rosen claim instead of focusing on treatment and recovery, new gun control legislation asks mental health professionals to predict what patients may or may not act on their violent thoughts. This type of legislation adds to the negative stereotype that individuals with mental illness are more prone to violence. The solution to fighting mental illness and gun violence is not to figure out when the attacks are going to happen, but rather to focus on helping these individuals realize they are not a threat to society. Wolf and Rosen propose these steps can help fight mental illness and gun violence in America. Number 1, amend current state mental health laws to increase funding and provide more readily accessible and comprehensive mental health services. 2, offer community programs and preventative training to allow for early intervention. And 3, fix the flaws in the federal and state background check system. Mental illness is not the root of gun violence, but rather the lack of care for both is what is causing our country to see a rise in both these fields. Throughout my study, I have found that the evidence that gun control and harsh crackdowns on guns are not the solutions to our problems. And yes, there is the argument that other countries have harsh gun control and they have fewer mass shootings. But there is also truth to the flip side of that argument. Guns are tools, and they are being used for the wrong purpose in America. And this is why we see gun violence. It is not because of racial issues, mental illness, or lack of regulation. It is from the lack of care for the people of this country. Gun safety and regulation is something that I believe should be used to provide a proper and safe way for people to buy guns from licensed dealers actively trying to remove the black market for guns and properly analyze who should have guns and who shouldn't.